My name is Hernan Tesler-Mabé, and I almost forgot my name there. And I am the president of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, and I would like to welcome you to our annual conference, the 2022 annual conference, that we are holding for a second consecutive year online. We hope that this will be, hope I'm not jinxing anything, the last purely virtual conference that we will be holding. We hope to be in person next year. But given the particular conditions in which we found ourselves, we decided to spotlight the idea of gatherings then and now. That is our theme for this year. And over the course of the next 3 days, we will be looking at a number of different ways in which gatherings can be configured, as well as any number of other important themes in the field of Canadian Jewish studies. So hopefully 3 days of learning, enjoying, sharing, and I will stop there in terms of my prefatory comments, but I welcome you all. It is a pleasure to have you, and I hope I'll get a chance to speak to you, to each and every one of you in some way or other over the next few days and over the subsequent year and years. And I will now turn it over to our tremendous conference chair, Jesse Toufexis, who has been lead on all this and who will be working us through all the rules and introducing the protocols for this conference. Thank you, Jesse.
Hey, everybody. Good to see everyone again. Like Hernan said, we're hoping to be in person next year. That would be great. But for now, after what I thought was a pretty successful virtual conference last year, we're doing it again this year. So I will be chairing the first panel. I'll go over some kind of ground rules to establish that for the conference, and then all the other chairs will kind of take my lead on that. So the way it's going to work is we have 3 speakers in this panel. Sometimes there will be 2, sometimes there will be more. There are 20 minutes per speaker. So I will alert the speaker when there's 10 minutes left, when there's 5 minutes left, 2 minutes, and 1 minute. And we will have all 3 speakers speak first, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. So instead of doing speaker, then question period, then speaker, then question period, we'll have all the speakers and then have a question period for everyone. I would ask that for anyone asking a question, ideally, we want to feature the speakers. So these are questions for the speakers, not statements, ideally. So please try to hold to that and allow the speakers to, put in the work here. Okay, so on our first panel, we have 3 speakers. We have Jonathan Slater, who's going first. He's the founding director of the Jewish Studies program at SUNY Plattsburgh, where he also leads the campus's Institute for Ethics in Public Life and chairs the Department of Journalism and Public Relations. We have Simone Grossman, professeure de littérature française et québécoise à l'Université Bar-Ilan en Israël, pour domaine de recherche actuel les écrivains juifs de Montréal. And we have Hadassah Danit O'Reilly, who is a research educator in the Holocaust and its genocide, integrating visual art and culture. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Jonathan Slater.
Thank you, Jesse. The title of my presentation is Naïm, Kattan, and the Canadian Comet. 2 major events marked the summer of 1967 in Quebec. There was, of course, the famous visit by French President Charles de Gaulle. It was during that visit that de Gaulle delivered the legendary rallying cry, Vive le Québec libre, from the balcony of Montreal City Hall, which some saw as part of a plot to abet the already divisive French nationalist politics gaining ground in Quebec since the Quiet Revolution. It was also the summer when the province hosted the 1967 World's Fair and Exposition, Expo 67. McGill theater professor Erin Hurley, in her book National Performance, contends that Expo catapulted the region onto the world stage. Expo began on April 27, 1967, and hosted 50 million visitors by the time it was over on October 29th. Writing 2 years later as part of a 3-volume series of notebooks he edited for the Cercle Juif de langue française, author Naïm Kattan states Expo was evidence that Montreal could set itself apart as a unique environment in North America. In Kattan's opinion, Expo showed the world that Montreal could be an international city, not just some run-of-the-mill cosmopolitan place without any character. While de Gaulle made time to tour Expo, another personality less well known to Quebecers was generating a lot of attention at Expo's Quebec Pavilion. University of Toronto professor, author, and communication scholar Marshall McLuhan. In 1967, McLuhan had been residing in New York City, serving as Albert Schweitzer Chair of the Humanities at Fordham University in the Bronx. McLuhan had traveled to Montreal in order to take part in the official launch of the French language edition of his groundbreaking 1962 work, The Gutenberg Galaxy. McLuhan set off a media storm in Quebec's French language press following his appearance at Expo. Both La Presse and Le Devoir diligently covered McLuhan's month-long visit to Quebec. Media's sage, as Montreal author Hugh McLennan had contemptuously called McLuhan, was already widely known by more celebratory honorifics such as the Oracle of the Electronic Age and Guru of the Global Village. 2 years earlier, Kattan, then a literary critic for Le Devoir, had benighted McLuhan le grand mage de l'âge de l'électricité. The French language daily had first taken notice of McLuhan in 1965 when Kattan published an interview with him. The same year, Kattan was penning a critical appreciation of the work of Mordecai Richler. Writing in Le Devoir on November 27th of that year, Kattan refers to McLuhan as the intellectual comet of Canada, a title first bestowed on McLuhan by Forbes magazine, although Kattan mistakenly credits Harper's as the bestower. Kattan interviewed McLuhan over lunch at the University of Toronto's faculty club. During the encounter, Kattan remarks that it's too bad McLuhan should remain largely unknown in French Canada, to which McLuhan replies it might be for the better that way. Kattan goes on to ask what McLuhan thinks about French-Canadian nationalism since the Quiet Revolution. McLuhan asserts that such nationalism is a natural consequence of the electric age. McLuhan uses this opportunity to explain the premise of his seminal 1964 book, Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man, which is that all communication media are technological extensions of the human body, and that we experience the effects of those media through every aspect of culture and society. Kattan then summarizes the essence of the Gutenberg Galaxy, in which McLuhan asserts that any technology tends to create a human environment, a new human environment. He further explains, technological environments are not merely passive containers of people, but are active processes that reshape people and other technologies alike. Kattan was an Iraqi-born Jew who wrote his first literary piece in Arabic in Baghdad at age 14. He arrived in Canada in 1954 after spending the post-war years studying law and literature at the Sorbonne in Paris. Once established in Montreal, Kattan made a career as a teacher, literary critic, and prolific writer of novels, essays, and other works. He became very active in the Cercle Juif de langue française in Montreal and edited the organization's bulletin during the 1960s. Kattan was also a member of the editorial board of Lettres Nouvelles out of Paris and Tamarack Review out of Toronto, and served on the board of Place des Arts. By the time of his death at age 92, just last summer, Kattan had been highly decorated both in Canada and France. Kattan began work in Montreal at the Canadian Jewish Congress, where he launched the Bulletin du Cercle Juif de langue française, designed to amplify the conversation among Francophone Jews and the majority Francophone population in general. Kattan, who by his own account was perfectly at ease in multiple ethnic and linguistic identities, stood alone for some time as the symbol of Francophone Jewry in Montreal. Kattan ran the Bulletin, the first non-Catholic Francophone publication in the province, for 13 years. In 1967, Kattan was made head of a literary publishing division of the Canada Arts Council, a position he held for 23 years. In 1994, Kattan took on a professorship at UQAM after serving 2 years as a professional writer in residence. The Cercle itself began in the late 1940s, largely under the direction of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and was created in order to extend intercultural dialogue beyond the clergy and make inroads into secular intellectual circles. The Cercle was conceived as a means to cultivate a positive rapport between the Jewish and Francophone communities in Quebec but not specifically intended as a tool for rapprochement among Francophone Jews and the non-Jewish Francophone population. It was merely seen as a way to improve cross-cultural communication, educate Jews about Francophone culture, and foster the relationship between Jews and Quebec Francophones. In essence, the Cercle acted as the Canadian Jewish Congress's public relations outreach into the Francophone community and served as a formal program to build goodwill on the part of the Jewish population toward the French Catholic population in direct response to the historical affinity Quebec Jews demonstrated for the largely Protestant English-speaking population segment. Unsurprisingly, Jewish participation in the Cercle's activities was far less enthusiastic than the significant involvement of non-Jewish Quebec Francophones. Kattan, who took over the leadership of the Cercle in 1954, changed the shape and focus of the organization. Kattan shifted the dialogues to invite participation from among French-speaking intellectuals and journalists, including at the time Radio-Canada's René Lévesque. Kattan's introduction of the bulletin was an important step, which coincided with the Canadian Jewish Congress starting to publish some of its own materials in French. Some of the intellectuals and journalists Kattan cultivated helped to identify common themes between the two groups. For example, a desire for increased contact, a common and beneficial defense of French language and culture, and fighting indifference to rapprochement between the two segments. In addition, Kattan believed the growing industrialization witnessed by the province in the late 1950s and concomitant economic expansion could help both groups to identify mutually beneficial objectives. Despite all these efforts, however, the secularization encouraged by the reconciliation inherent in both the Quiet Revolution and Vatican II attenuated the need for a concerted rapprochement. So what prompted Kattan's interest in Marshall McLuhan? The Cercle Juif de langue française seems an unlikely place to have harbored a nest of McLuhanites. What appeal could an English-speaking prairie Protestant turned Catholic hold for a Francophone Jew from Baghdad living in bustling Montreal? McLuhan was born in Edmonton and grew up in Winnipeg, where he studied at the University of Manitoba. McLuhan then set off to Cambridge, where he converted to Catholicism. He spent several years in teaching posts in the United States before settling in sedate Toronto, where he spent the remainder of his career teaching at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. A prolific writer and celebrated public intellectual, McLuhan is considered the founding figure and patron saint of the Toronto School of Communication Theory, in which McLuhan gave birth to the field of media ecology, a branch of media studies that focuses on the nature of media themselves. Kattan made his initial personal contact with McLuhan in November 1965, writing to him on Cercle letterhead in order to arrange the interview for Le Devoir. By the time Kattan requested the interview, he had already been closely following McLuhan's work for some time. Writing in the fall of 1967, Kattan argued that part of McLuhan's appeal was that he spoke to a new cultural elite, an elite that was no longer content to accommodate the reality of modern industrialized society. This observation seems particularly poignant, given that Kattan, writing elsewhere that year, recognized that the changes shaking up Quebec were numerous and deep. During McLuhan's visit to Montreal during Expo, publisher Claude Hurtebise hosted a cocktail party in his honor. The publisher invited 15 guests, including Kattan. At the party, Kattan narrowly avoided starting an argument with McLuhan about whether Arabic was considered a phonetic language. It had been Kattan who originally proposed to Hurtebise to obtain translation rights to the English language works by McLuhan, and another major Canadian cultural figure, McLuhan's colleague and intellectual antagonist at the University of Toronto, Northrop Frye. According to literary theorist Linda Hutcheon, McLuhan's interest in technology and questions of media power and control was very different from Frye's focus on the transforming and liberating power of the poetic imagination. Kattan also lamented the inaccessibility of McLuhan's works to the literati of Paris. Journalist and McLuhan confidant Jean Paré already had translated a couple of McLuhan's books, including The Gutenberg Galaxy mentioned earlier, first released in English in 1962 and appearing in French in 1967. French publisher Le Seuil tried to negotiate the translation rights for France, but Hurtebise refused to cede them, and the work was republished in France using Paré's translation. Hurtebise succeeded in gaining rights to some of Frye's books, but the translation of the author's classic Anatomy of Criticism was already held by Gallimard. The launch of the French language version of the Gutenberg Galaxy in the summer of 1967 was auspicious for two reasons. First, the work was the first French translation of a work by McLuhan carried out entirely in Quebec. While there had already been a French publication by Paré of McLuhan's seminal text, Understanding Media, the initial translation was produced in France, not North America. Second, McLuhan was present at the launch, conducted with great fanfare at Montreal's Expo 67. As noted earlier, McLuhan was all the rage and attracted a great deal of attention from French language news outlets and a handful of Quebec elite. The escalating hype growing around McLuhan in the late 60s would parallel the Trudeau mania coalescing around Pierre Trudeau roughly at the same time. According to Canadian studies scholar Brian Palmer, McLuhan managed to become what was most unlikely, a Canadian academic whose star stature resonated in increasingly wide circles. In Quebec, McLuhan's ideas were gaining ground within a much smaller, yet intellectually influential circle. That circle included Kattan and Paré, as well as radio and television host and self-made mystic Jacques Languirand. René Lévesque also seemed intrigued by McLuhan's novel way of thinking about mass media. Further, McLuhan's philosophy attracted attention among Quebec's separatist circles, for example, in coverage by the leftist political journal Parti Pris that began in 1963 and ceased publication in 1968. The late president of Trent University, Donald Thiel, a communication scholar and former student of McLuhan, explains that Languirand was attracted to McLuhan's ideas because McLuhan's interest in esotericism and occultism were well recognized in Canada, particularly in Quebec. McLuhan ostensibly was fascinated by secret societies and became obsessed by the existence of Gnostic conspiracies, mystery religions, and cults. Languirand's 1972 book, De McLuhan à Pythagore, a rambling pastiche of occultism, esotericism, and conspiracy theories, explores McLuhan's relation to Hermetic and occult wisdom. According to communication and cultural theorist Gary Janosko at York, Lévesque, the journalist, was central to Quebec's entry into the age of television and a driving force behind the internationalization of French-Canadian society in the 1950s. Through his work at Radio-Canada, where he collaborated with Languirand on the news magazine Carrefour. Kattan's own connection to Lévesque also goes back to Carrefour when Lévesque interviewed Kattan for 15 minutes in October 1954 about le Cercle Juif. In 1973, Lévesque channeled McLuhan in a long article on the revolutionary effects of television in Quebec without once mentioning McLuhan by name. In that piece, which appeared in Hydro-Québec's magazine Force, Lévesque asserts that television was the greatest revolutionary force in ways people perceived one another. In Quebec, he contends, television helped the Francophone population to emerge from a closed society and historical complacency and allowed Quebec Francophones to contest and protest the accepted environment and break down old taboos. Paré notes there was a commonly held belief in the decade following the Quiet Revolution that television permitted Quebec Francophones to take stock of their majority standing in their own province and appreciate their role as a distinct people within Canada and as a whole, not merely an ethnic minority stuck in a one-down position in greater English-speaking Canada. Television, first introduced into Quebec in 1952, dramatically reoriented French speakers' understanding of themselves and their status at home in Quebec, thus prompting Quebec Francophones to profoundly question their institutional relationships with English-speaking Canada, what McLuhan terms the shock of recognition. Asked what might have contributed to the development of Quebec nationalism, political scientist Louis Balthazar points to the introduction of television in the province. He observes that one of the original goals of Radio-Canada was to bring Canadians together. However, because Radio-Canada's principal audience was in Quebec, the media outlet had quite the opposite effect. It brought Quebec Francophones together, but further delineated the distinction between English and French Canada. Television introduced a new dimension into social arrangements in Quebec. The technology helped to erode interpersonal and intergroup boundaries between the two linguistic communities. The network showed Quebec Francophones an image of themselves and at the same time exposed them to the leading French language journalists of the day. Television, according to Lévesque, also helped to create and sustain a new intellectual elite in the province by rendering them visible to the viewing public and in the process elevating them to a certain level of stardom. It therefore was not surprising that Quebec nationalism took root organically and institutionally in the medium of television. Marshall McLuhan's Western Canadian upbringing would likely have kept him at some psychic distance from the nationalist turbulence in Quebec. Nevertheless, observing events unfold in Quebec from the sheltering environment of St. Michael's College in Toronto, Marshall McLuhan appeared genuinely concerned for the future of Quebec and publicly espoused an affinity for the plight of Quebec francophones. He was keenly aware that English Canadians were the environment of French Canada. He viewed the sometimes violent perturbations in Quebec's political and social climate as a quest for identity. McLuhan contends in his last television interview that Quebec francophones likely were feeling very abrasive about the English community. In a 2010 reminiscence about his conversations with McLuhan, Paré recalls that McLuhan had once admitted in private that he would have fought alongside the French against the English had he, McLuhan, been a French Canadian. What McLuhan actually says, recounted in Paré's lengthier treatment of the exchange in an article published in Force in 1973 is, and I'm quoting here, "If I were a French Canadian, I would spend most of my energy fighting the bastards who ran the country, who made it English. Yes, I would. I'd be a violent anti-English person if I lived in Quebec. But on the other hand, I can be just as violently anti-English right here," meaning Toronto, "but the English really have lost everything. So it is no longer much fun kicking them in the ass because they're finished, you know. They have had it. They are the dropouts of our times." In his final memoir, Carrefour d'une vie, published in 2016, Kattan identifies McLuhan as one of the major influences upon his professional life. Kattan passionately believed that McLuhan rejected the idea of aristocratic or bourgeois dominance of new communication techniques. Rather, Kattan was of the opinion that McLuhan advocated popular control of those techniques. Kattan's admiration for McLuhan also likely stemmed from the latter's overt political sympathy for Quebec francophones. Kattan was preoccupied too with issues of identity, evident throughout his work, starting with his 1975 memoir, Adieu Babylone. McLuhan understood the consequences of technological shifts upon cultural identity. He believed by seeking refuge in our technological constructs, we abandon our natural selves and in turn relinquish our identities. A loss of identity, he conjectured, could act as a prelude to violence and foreshadow a retribalization of society. Kattan also came to know McLuhan and his work from a rather exclusive perch. In addition to understanding and appreciating what McLuhan was postulating, Kattan knew McLuhan personally and to a certain degree came to understand his habits of mind. Kattan partook in serious conversations with McLuhan and interceded for him in publishing matters. Kattan was by no means the sole intellectual beneficiary of a connection to McLuhan. He shared the privilege more or less with such prominent Quebec personalities as Jacques Languirand, René Lévesque, and Jean Paré, who in their own respective fashion valued the insights they gained from McLuhan's work during what we now look back on as a pivotal and formative decade in Quebec history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was awesome. That's great. All right, we're going to go straight into our second one now. So we have Simone Grossman from Ilan University. Her paper is titled Déchirement et perdition chez les jeunes filles hassidiques dans Yiosh de Magali Sauves. So go ahead, Simone. Thank you.
Merci. Une petite seconde, je commence tout de suite. Je remonte à mon texte. Les chassidim d'Outremont et leur mode de vie exercent sur leur environnement social une fascination mêlée de curiosité. Dans des fictions littéraires et filmiques québécoises, leur altérité et leur refus du vivre ensemble suscitent le désir de mieux les connaître et de se rapprocher d'eux. C'est le cas dans des romans tels que Le sourire de la petite juive d'Abla Faroud, Hadassah de Myriam Baudouin et Nous avons tous découvert l'Amérique de Francine Noël, auxquels on peut joindre la BD Salomé et les hommes en noir, où une petite fille venue de France porte un regard candide sur ses nouveaux voisins hassidiques. Yiosh, troisième roman de Magali Sauves, paru en 2014, se démarque des œuvres dites de la conciliation. Sauves, écrivaine juive, montréalaise d'origine française, a enseigné le français dans une école de filles hassidiques et connaît bien la communauté, bien qu'elle n'en fasse pas partie. Elle décrit dans Yiosh les tentatives d'affirmation de deux adolescentes écartelées entre la norme du milieu et leur aspiration personnelle à l'autonomie. Selon la sociologue Sandrine Mallard, une des manières de renforcer l'appartenance identitaire hassidique et de consolider les frontières visant à se séparer des autres est de dépeindre négativement ceux qui n'appartiennent pas à leur communauté. Mon propos montrera que, dans Yiosh, la représentation critique du milieu hassidique vise à dénoncer tant sa fermeture que l'auto-valorisation positive abusive de la société hassidique. Nous verrons qu'à travers la mise en scène de deux adolescentes transgressant l'interdit des contacts avec le monde extérieur, une distinction s'opère avec les vrais justes, hassidiques ou non, et les autres. Je résume très brièvement, autant possible, le roman. Alexandra, jeune russe de lointaine origine hassidique, doit fuir avec son frère un foyer familial toxique. Suite à des circonstances malheureuses, sa mère Roizy, descendante d'un disciple du Baal Shem Tov, fondateur du mouvement hassidique, est devenue une prostituée. Alexandra a été violée par un client ivre. Elle est accueillie chez la famille Sporn, chassidim d'Outremont. Rebaptisée Ziva, elle tente de s'adapter à leur mode de vie. Dans la chambre qui lui est allouée, elle découvre dans une cachette les 4 exemplaires de Twilight, œuvre culte de la littérature vampirique de jeunesse, et un journal intime adressé à Bella, héroïne du roman, dissimulé dans un coin. Il s'avère que Feggy Sporn, jeune fille chassidique bon teint en apparence, est écartelée entre son appartenance à la communauté, elle dit « moi je suis une chasside », et son aspiration à la modernité, elle dit « mes pensées appartiennent à une fille moderne ». Elle lit des livres défendus, souhaite communiquer avec les non-chassidiques, exècre le rasage des cheveux obligatoire pour les femmes mariées et refuse d'être fiancée à un jeune chasside choisi par ses parents sans la consulter. Agressée dans la rue par des voyous, elle est sauvée par un non-juif, François Châtelain, qu'elle revoit à plusieurs reprises. Or, François n'est pas un monstre. Son grand-père a aidé des chassidim à fuir les nazis pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Feggy, quand elle est encore parmi les siens, est déchirée entre son amour pour François et la règle chassidique. Elle se décrit comme une fille impure et dépravée et une pauvre imbécile des idées plein la tête et le cœur en morceaux. Elle mène mentalement une double vie, anticipant sur son rejet imminent de la communauté et l'impossibilité d'une véritable relation de couple avec François. Surprise en compagnie de ce dernier dans le parc avoisinant, elle est bannie des chassidim. Depuis, vivant aux côtés de François sans partager son intimité, elle s'étiole dans une vie qu'elle n'a pas vraiment choisie. À la fin, devenue anorexique, déchirée entre son refus de l'idéal chassidique du mariage et son incapacité à renier son identité, elle se suicide. Ziva a reçu une éducation profane en Russie. Elle ne croit pas en Dieu et ignore les commandements de la Torah. Née de père inconnu, je cite, fille de pute et petite fille de rescapée de la Shoah, elle se réfugie souvent au musée de l'Ermitage, foyer imaginaire où elle s'invente une nouvelle famille. Son fantasme est étayé par sa ressemblance à l'enfant au fouet de Renoir. Convaincue que c'est son propre portrait qui est accroché au mur, elle fouille le passé pour trouver un lien familial entre elle et l'enfant du tableau. Ses recherches généalogiques l'amènent dans une autre direction, à un aïeul maternel, disciple du Baal Shem Tov, qui sera à la fois le modèle inspirant à qui se comparer et le passe-droit pour faire quitter la Russie à elle et à son frère. À Montréal, elle ne trouve pas chez les Sporn les conditions d'un nouvel équilibre. La mère alcoolique est négligée par son mari et la famille secrètement amputée de la sœur aînée excommuniée. De plus, la maisonnée est régie par Goldie, femme du Dayan, à l'autorité usurpée et à l'affût du moindre manquement. La lointaine ascendance chassidique ne sert de rien pour la reconstruction de son identité. À peine arrivée, son apparence extérieure est changée par la coupe de cheveux et les vêtements réglementaires. Dûment initiée aux règles de vie des chassidim, elle se sent en inadéquation avec eux. Sa quête prend un tournant définitif dans sa chambre. Assoupie sur le banc, jouxtant la fenêtre, enseignée sur le parc, elle est emportée en rêve par, je cite, l'oriel béant, grande voile gonflée voguant vers l'inconnu. L'astronef onirique en forme de balle, je cite, roulant par-dessus les terres, les montagnes, les déserts et les mers, toujours plus vite, l'entraîne jusqu'à Saint-Pétersbourg, dans la salle Renoir de l'Ermitage, confondue à la chambre d'Outremont, où apparaît l'enfant au fouet tenant un cœur vivant. Je vous amènerai d'abord la relation intertextuelle entre Yiosh et Twilight, basée sur la similarité entre Feggy, chassidique amoureuse d'un non-juif, et Bella, humaine amoureuse d'un vampire. Toutes deux établissent une relation avec un étranger au groupe, qu'il s'agisse des humains ou des chassidim. En outre, les situations se répètent, comme l'attaque des voyous contre Bella et Feigi, dans des circonstances analogues et entravées dans les deux cas par un sauveteur hors norme. Nous allons voir que la relation intertextuelle entre Twilight et Yiosh se rapporte aux conséquences tragiques de l'extermination quasi totale des chassidim pendant la Shoah. À l'exception d'un groupe arrivé en 1941 en passant par l'Extrême-Orient, les rescapés des chassidim d'Europe sont arrivés au Canada dans l'après-guerre et en voulant reconstituer leur communauté disparue. Issus du traumatisme et de la perte, leur refus de communiquer avec le monde extérieur implique l'interdiction de lire des livres non autorisés, irrecevables pour Ziva et Feigi, et qui va aboutir donc à la réécriture de Twilight. La lecture revêt une importance majeure pour les deux adolescentes. Chez les chassidim, la lecture de livres est autorisée dans les limites de la conformité à la norme religieuse. On lui dit, ne lis pas de livres interdits. Ça fait partie des prescriptions négatives qui sont inculquées à Ziva dès son arrivée et qui sont un peu le pendant parodique des 5 commandements négatifs des tables de la loi. Toutes ces interdictions font que Ziva et Feigi font des incursions clandestines à la Bibliothèque juive de Montréal et à la librairie Outremont. Lire des livres est pour elle indispensable à la construction de leur identité. Ziva est assoiffée de connaissances sur l'histoire juive qu'elle n'a pu acquérir à Saint-Pétersbourg. Feigi récuse les restrictions imposées sur les livres autorisés mais édulcorés. Comme elle s'en ouvre à Bella, j'en avais marre des livres censurés, ces vilaines cicatrices laissées par le crayon noir. À l'école, on lit du bout des cils. Ziva est déçue que les autres élèves de l'école n'apprécient pas les livres d'imagination, ne veulent lire ni Harry Potter, ni les contes de Maupassant, mais seulement des récits basés sur des faits authentiques. Même Le Petit Prince est jugé stupide. Leur manque d'intérêt pour la littérature éloigne d'elle Ziva, qui sent sa solitude se renforcer. Feigi déplore elle aussi l'impossibilité de partager ses impressions de lecture avec les autres. Elle a vu une jeune passante de son âge en jupe jean ultra courte, t-shirt rose et basket noir, tenue interdite pour elle. Elle éprouve une impossible envie de lui parler de Bella. Complément indispensable de la lecture, la discussion sur les livres est part intégrante de la construction de leur identité. La lecture est l'activité favorite de Feigi. Je lis trop, c'est le problème. Je parcours des livres totalement proscrits. Elle domine sa peur d'être repérée et dénoncée en prétendant aller à la bibliothèque juive alors qu'en vérité, elle se rend à la librairie Outremont. Elle se plonge totalement dans les livres, comme le remarque François, frappé que, je cite, « toutes les émotions occasionnées par sa lecture se reflètent sur son visage ». Et il est catastrophé à juste titre lorsqu'elle est trop déprimée pour lire. Ouvrant de nouvelles perspectives sur le monde extérieur, ne serait-ce que celle occasionnée par le trajet nécessaire pour se les procurer, la lecture initie en particulier les adolescentes à la connaissance de l'amour, sujet tabou chez les chassidim. Comme Ziva le constate, c'est difficile de trouver une bonne histoire qui ne parle pas d'amour. À cet égard, Feigi ne se comporte pas différemment des filles de son âge, dont l'engouement pour Twilight est motivé par l'exposition des problèmes liés à la sexualité. Comme on l'a observé, Twilight offre aux jeunes lectrices la possibilité d'explorer la sexualité en toute sécurité dans une fiction, sans être impliquée ni exploitée. John I. Mercer, théologienne, fait valoir que, je cite, « les filles aiment leurs vampires, adorent lire à leur sujet, les regarder à l'écran, fantasmer sur eux et en parler avec les autres. » Feigi, refusant le mariage arrangé non basé sur l'amour réciproque, trouve dans Twilight l'équivalent imaginaire de son attirance pour François. Nous verrons maintenant que l'amour qui épanouit est l'antidote de l'étouffement ressenti par Feigi chez les chassidim, dû à l'atmosphère oppressante régnant dans la communauté. L'imprégnation du motif vampirique tient essentiellement à la constriction de la gorge chez ceux qui les approchent. Le titre du roman, Yiosh, éponyme d'une exclamation yiddish exprimant la contrariété, n'est jamais prononcé à voix haute. Soupir à peine audible, Yiosh est l'équivalent verbal des raclements de gorge des personnages. Alexandra, qui n'est pas encore Ziva, apercevant pour la première fois le couple de Sporn posté à l'écart de la foule à l'aéroport, manque de s'étrangler. Yiosh, s'étouffa-t-elle. Zut! Écartant la tentation d'une fuite encore possible, elle les rejoint quand même, reprenant son souffle. À nouveau, elle se racle la gorge devant les murs gris de la maison Sporn, dont elle perçoit d'emblée l'essence carcérale. Marquant son refus inavoué d'être une racide, la sensation de râpe dans la gorge revient chez elle lorsque son frère Renat l'appelle Alexandra au téléphone, lui rappelant la perte de son vrai moi. Sa gorge brûle lors de sa rencontre avec le grand-père paternel, Abraham Sporn, qui se racle lui-même la gorge à 2 reprises, lorsqu'il est forcé de céder à la pression du milieu familial et de se conformer aux usages. À la fin du roman, la triple occurrence de Yiosh, pour un Yiosh, c'est un putain de Yiosh, accompagne le dernier échange visuel entre Ziva quittant les Spornes et Abraham, tiraillé entre l'identité chassidique et sa propre conception. Yiosh traduit également la frustration de Feigui à l'écoute des projets de film de François sur son grand-père qui a aidé des chassidim à se fuir pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Yiosh, de quoi parle-t-il? Elle a honte de cette culture amputée par la culture chassidique, les leçons tronquées, les textes balafrés et de la seule image de la Joconde autorisée au décolleté pudiquement rhabillé. Yiosh est pour elle un aveu d'impuissance face à l'interdiction de contact avec le monde extérieur. Son angoisse du vide est traduite par le serrement de poitrine et le raclement de gorge. Ma poitrine me serre, ma gorge racle trop sèche. Je voudrais hurler, je reste impassible. J'irradie le désespoir. L'adjectif rauque caractérise également l'expression verbale entravée, telle la voix rauque de Feigui, clamant son droit au savoir historique censuré par les chassidim qu'elle assimile aux nazis. Je cite, « Les nazis nous ont dépersonnalisés. La communauté, que fait-elle? Exactement la même chose, lance Feigui à Abraham à propos de l'interdiction frappant le journal d'Anne Frank, jugé incorrect par les censeurs chassidiques. Yiosh est l'expression de la résistance à la coercition et à la pression sociale de la communauté, empêchant les individus de respirer. Notons que la mouvance des significations confère des sens différents à des phénomènes analogues. Dans Twilight, la constriction de la gorge, élément basique de la littérature vampirique, se rattache à des faits négatifs et positifs. Signe d'une émotion indicible chez Bella, la gorge serrée manifeste autant sa terreur lors de son attaque par les voyous que son choc face à la sollicitude d'Edward, changeant les clés de sa voiture. La sensation d'étranglement est également liée chez Bella à la beauté époustouflante d'Edward, qui est d'ailleurs un vampire inoffensif pour les humains. Dans Yiosh, l'étranglement est imputable aux forces mauvaises, incarnées par des personnages empêchant les autres de vivre. Goldie Wurzberger, femme du Dayan, fait régner la terreur comme Roisy à Saint-Pétersbourg chez elle. Je cite, l'analogie était osée entre une femme de Dayan et des prédateurs sexuels. Pourtant, elles se comprenaient. Les deux imposaient leur présence, exigeaient des courbettes et la regardaient de travers. Écrasante et malhonnête, Sa Majesté Goldie comprend qu'elle est démasquée par la petite Russe qui a compris son accusation fausse de vol contre la pauvre femme de ménage espagnole lorsque des bouteilles de vin ont disparu. Abraham Sporn, le grand-père, la surnomme dérisoirement en yiddish Alte Machashaife, vieille sorcière, en l'assimilant au sorcier, aspirant la vitalité de sa victime comme un vampire. Goldie est aussi représentée et décrite comme une sangsue qui se gorge de la vitalité des autres et les empêche de vivre. Ziva, qui aurait juré apercevoir ses babines se retrousser, se sent sa proie comme une souris entre les pattes d'un horrible matou. Par la faute de Goldie, qui se charge de lui expédier son trousseau de mariée, Feigui meurt sans que le grand-père puisse intervenir. Assimilé à un prédateur sexuel, Goldie incarne la déformation de l'esprit chassidique véritable. L'écart entre la piété théorique et celle imposée à l'école et dans la communauté produit des êtres inhumains, comme la sorcière, femme toute puissante, ainsi que les chippies malveillantes de l'école, qui rejoignent des sorcières de la littérature empirique. Réexaminons d'autres exemples aussi de Yiosh à Twilight. Par exemple, la délicieuse odeur de lavande dont François est imprégné sert d'antidote aux exhalaisons malsaines de peinture et de rats crevés des lieux confinés de la communauté chassidique. En présence de François, Feigui respire avec bonheur son odeur de lavande. Ma tête me tourne, de la lavande, son parfum. François portait une autre Cologne à la lavande, un secret de famille poivré élaboré par son grand-père. Feigui, humant la lavalière mauve parfumée à la lavande poivrée, oubliée par François dans la pâtisserie où ils se rencontrent, écho la même chose. Dans Twilight, Edward est attiré par l'odeur de lavande de Bella, par l'effet de la réécriture, consistant dans la reconversion d'éléments d'un texte premier au profit de significations nouvelles. Le motif de l'odorat, lié à la nourriture dans la littérature empirique, est associé à l'amour remède dans Yiosh. Parce que son milieu chassidique l'a empêché de connaître la passion, Feigui emprunte à la fiction de Meyer l'expression de l'amour. La lavande du Vercors, cultivée par le grand-père de François qui a trouvé des chassidim envers soi pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale, symbolise doublement la respiration libérée et la liberté pour les Juifs traqués. La femme de Joseph Katz, le chassid sauvé, s'appelle aussi Feigui. François, le petit-fils, libère Feigui Sporn, menacé d'étouffement et empêché d'aimer, comme Jean, son grand-père, a aidé Feigui Katz à s'évader. Telle la lavande libératrice, la même effluve de fraises du shampoing favori de Bella dans Twilight, parfume la chevelure de la petite Simi Sporn, lavée avec le shampoing, avec fraisinette sur la bouteille, spécialité québécoise, triviale en apparence, mais signe d'ouverture sur la société extérieure. Ziva hume profondément l'odeur de fraise pour échapper momentanément au miasme de l'ambiance familiale des Sporn. Par l'effet d'un sémantisme plurivoque, La fraise associée à la nourriture connote négativement la dévoration vampirique, à travers Ziva aspirant l'odeur de sémi. Toutefois, sa senteur est valorisée positivement. La mouvance du sens fournit dans un instantané l'image d'une Ziva elle-même vampire. Un autre effet de la réécriture intertextuelle concerne l'origine des vampires. À leur origine supprimée s'ajoute, à leurs origines supposées s'ajoute dans Yiosh la conjoncture historique, persécutions et massacres, facteur d'un passéisme qui pervertit les chassidim. Comme Pierre Anctil l'expose, il n'y a aucun doute que l'expérience du génocide, de la persécution, sous des formes aiguës, colore encore très nettement leur vision d'eux-mêmes et de la société dans laquelle ils vivent, expliquant leur repli social et leur immobilisme culturel. Les traumatismes du passé les empêchent d'évoluer. Alexandra, non encore viva, encore une fois, quand elle aperçoit de loin le couple d'Eshporn, elle le voit comme le négatif figé d'un ancien cliché d'une production vidéo numérique contre dimension. Fegui critique dans son journal le maintien forcé de coutumes désuètes relatives à un autre âge, telle l'obligation du rasage des cheveux des femmes mariées, datant de l'époque où les Cosaques attrapaient les femmes par leurs tresses pour les enlever. Fière de ce conservatisme, la communauté s'enorgueillit de perpétuer un mode de vie où Moïse lui-même ne serait pas dépaysé. Je consacrerai un dernier petit développement à la thématique de l'oiseau. Feigi, signifiant oiseau en yiddish, est le nom des 3 femmes chassidiques. Celle du présent, Feigi Shporn, celle du passé récent de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, Feigi Katz, et Feigi, la petite fille du Baal Shem Tov. Rappelons en passant que le mot hébraïque chassida, féminin de chassid, désigne la cigogne, donc un oiseau. Une relation de parenté par affiliation les réunit. Feigi est le nom générique des femmes chassidiques ressemblant à des oiseaux. Feigi Shporn, allongée sur le drap de son trousseau de jeune mariée, qu'elle ne va jamais utiliser, a coupé elle-même sa chevelure. Feigi, oiseau tombé du nid ou plutôt de son oriel dans un parc, échangé en triste oiselle déplumée, selon le rituel de la nouvelle épousée, et elle pépille le Shema Israël du dernier repos. Elle expire en tenant la cravate de François à l'odeur de lavande et en embrassant ce dernier sur la bouche. N'est-elle pas la fille biologique de la pauvre Malky à la nuque rasée, jadis une belle rousse, jalousée, ressemblant maintenant à une triste autruche tondeuse, donnant naissance à 2 jumelles dénommées d'après le pardon et l'espoir. Comme les autres métaphores, celle de l'oiseau est polysémique. À la femme oiseau, victime comme Ziva, qui se sent depuis son arrivée à Outremont comme un pigeon d'argile, touché en plein vol par un tir à droit, se superpose Tsipi, diminutif de Tsipora, oiseau au féminin en hébreu, une échasse blonde et pédante, prédatrice méchante et omnisciente, qui exclut Ziva des distractions en commun. Pour une part, l'oiseau connote le vampirisme ambiant du roman, où des prédateurs font la chasse à des victimes innocentes. Contrebalançant leur valorisation négative, les oiseaux, qui sont, je cite, l'un des dénominateurs communs du monde, associés aux fleurs sur l'étoffe recouvrant le fauteuil du château, en rappel du sauvetage des chassidim pendant la guerre, figurent la sérénité et l'harmonie. En définitive, et pour clore mon propos, je citerai encore le passage du journal de Feigi, où la magnifique rose est pourvue de grosses épines argentées et aiguisées comme des lames de couteau, métaphorisant la famille Sporn, mot signifiant en allemand l'épine attachée au talon de la botte du cavalier. Dans le milieu chassidique d'Outremont, spécifiquement québécois, représenté par Sauves dans Yiosh, la plurivocité des valeurs narratives penche en faveur de la jeune fille chassidique amoureuse du français et d'une France amie. Feigi, réincarnant symboliquement les chassidim pourchassés, représentant d'une tendance culturelle opposée à celle d'autres chassidim de New York, par exemple. Fait rare pour une chassid de Montréal, parlant le yiddish et accessoirement l'anglais, Feigi aime la langue française, dont l'usage lui manque lors de son séjour chez sa famille à Amansi. Pour finir, l'écriture libère une question, j'ai cité Roland Barthes, ne pouvant que traduire l'instabilité des normes et la fausseté des clichés. Restent les histoires chassidiques où des personnages, je cite, endossent les qualités traditionnelles des figures bibliques et d'autres symbolisent les travers d'une société corrompue. Je citerai pour finir Jessica Roda, selon qui seule une ethnographie de l'intime permet d'accéder à l'espace privé et peut révéler la complicité d'un monde, à savoir ses oppositions. Merci.
Merci, Simone. Magnifique. Okay, we're going to go to the next one. I'm just going to stop my alarm so it doesn't go off while I'm talking. Okay. Our last speaker is Hadassah Danit O'Reilly, and her paper is entitled Considering Jews as the Target of Christian Anti-Semitism, confirmed in the Christie Pitts graphic novel. So go ahead, Hadassah.
Just gotta get my PowerPoint set up here.
Go for it.
Oh. So I need to screen share. Okay.
We can make you the co-host. There we go.
And, is it, oh, what happened? Is it left?
Oh, I think you went to the end of the slideshow.
Oh, did I? Hold on. Oh, yes, I did. Oh, this is open. There. There we go. Okay. Apologize. Okay. Jamie Michaels, author of the Christie Tits graphic novel, said, although a work of fiction, this story is grounded in the real history of Toronto. His research for the novel examined archives and old newspapers and scholarly books, and he interviewed some of the family members of people who witnessed or participated in the riot. Indeed, some are fictional characters and some are historical events, people, and places. As an example, the YMHA, the Toronto Workers' Strike, and Sam Parker, a member of Parliament, Toronto Centre West. Throughout this narrative and illustrations, the momentum culminates with a depiction of a course of events which erupted in Toronto's Christie Tits on August the 16th, 1933. The events are A quarterfinal baseball game between Jewish Harvard Playground Jews versus the white Protestants of St. Peter's team. B, members of the anti-Semitic Pitts gang who were on a hill with spectators overlooking the playing field, whereupon they unfurled a swastika emblem. And C, they raised their arms in a Nazi salute, uttering Sieg Heil, and a young man shouted, "Better luck next time, yids." Hostilities reaching a turning point when Jewish youths who were spectators witnessed the disparaging scene. They instantly darted towards the swastika sign, aided by Italians and other social groups, attacking the youth on the hill. The Nazi sympathizers sprang into action, joined by Anglo fans and the St. Peter's team as the hostility exploded into ethnic violence. After reading of this historical Toronto anti-Semitic story, the questions I ask are, why did Canadians seem indifferent? Why did Christian Canada shirk its responsibility that led to the violence towards Jews that fateful day? Why was there minimal anti-Semitic public resistance? Why was there no outcry towards the anti-Semitic Christian institutions? And furthermore, is history once again repeating itself? Should society be on the alert against the new rallying cry? Therefore, the background of Canada's anti-Semitism is complex, and the aim is to examine why Toronto's Christian community in the 1930s harbored deep anti-Semitic beliefs, as the novel Christie depicts. First, I'm not engaged in theology, nor am I making a determined contribution to official Jewish relations. Secondly, I am specifically clarifying Christian issues as they pertain to Jews in 1930s Canada. My primary purpose is to find a place of truth from which to broadly view and evaluate Jewish-Christian relationships. Thirdly, as to whether there is truth in the Christian religious timeframe of the 1930s, which involved hostility and hatred toward Jews. Fourthly, was any form of anti-Semitism supported, promoted, and condoned by Christian organizations in Canada? 150 years ago, Canada was a Christian nation. On July 1st, 1867, the newest country in the world rejoiced in the title Dominion and took it as its motto, a term that was plucked from the New Testament, Psalm chapter 72, verse 8, Amen, Amari isk admer, from sea to sea. Religion infused culture, politics, and everyday life. It steered one's vote, one's choice of friends, and place of education. To be a responsible citizen, one had to be a churchgoer. As religion infused day-to-day life, the silence of the Roman Catholic Church must be explored when addressing Canadian Roman Catholic communities' hatred toward Jews. Professor Emeritus of European History at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth said, within the Roman Catholic religion, papal policy was regularly church policy. The Pope's pronounced God's will is the greatest decree for world authority. During disputes amongst Christian nations in the First and Second World Wars, the popes circumvented certain political advocacy, not because the papacy was not interested, but because any defined papal support for one Christian country over another would alienate one of the belligerents. As his medieval counterparts, Pope Pius XI, from 1922 to 1939, adhered to a Jewish policy that combined realpolitik with a perfunctory protection and demonizing Jews, a program embedded in the basic canons of the Church's anti-Jewish theology. Indeed, the Roman Catholic Church was a highly structured institution that had the potential to help the Jews. Having any influential position, the Roman Catholic Church at any time between 1933 and 1945 could have made a difference how Roman Catholics responded to Hitler's regime. Popes did not cease to believe Jews were Christ killers with no basic right to live amongst Christians. Christian anti-Semitism dates back to the burgeoning divide between early Christian peoples and Jewish leaders in the age of Judah. Catholicism from 1850 to 1950 to a high degree was centralized and controlled, while a definite pattern of worship became habitual for the majority of Canadian Roman Catholics. This was attained in the form of an expanded number of devotions set in a frame of fervent and lively piety. Devotion to the papacy culminated in 1870 when the dogma of papal infallibility was defined, and subsequent popes firmly encouraged special devotions. The crucifix adorned many Roman Catholic homes, and wayside crosses and shrines were built in large Roman Catholic populous areas. It was only after 1960 that this passionate piety would dissipate. Within many Canadian Roman Catholic communities, the potential connection between Jews and Christians had been tarnished by suspicion, anger, and hate. Roman Catholic belief was that Jews are the culprits for the death of Christianity's founder, Jesus Christ. The former allegation of deicide inflammatory was both inflammatory and an unjust denunciation, as it equipped religious and secular authorities with justification for stigmatizing and persecuting Jews, and unjust because it sentenced all Jews in perpetuity for the deeds of a minimum number of their ancestors. It established the basis of the Roman Catholic Church-sponsored anti-Semitic prejudices and in the readings of the Gospels found in the New Testament, reveal the hostility attributed to the Jews, obstinate refusal to accept Jesus Christ, the Son of God's teachings about the law and the kingdom of God. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, 31, 33, it is written, "Thus you show that you are sons of the prophets, murderers. Now it is your turn. Fill up the vessel measured out by our forefathers, viper's nests, brood of serpents. How can you escape condemnation to Gehenna?" Interesting facts of the first of many denunciations of Jews are found in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, when John the Baptist made his appearance as a preacher in the desert of Judea, this was his theme: Reform your lives. The reign of God is at hand. John the Baptist continues in Matthew chapter 3, verses 7-9. When he saw the many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees were stepping forward for this bath, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who told you to flee from the wrath to come? God can raise up children to Abraham from these very stones." Similarly, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, verses 7-9, repeated Matthew's exact words. Also, the Epistle of the Hebrews' basic teaching centers on the showing superiority of the Christian religion over Judaism. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 3, Christ is also superior to Moses, as the builder of a house has more honor than a house. The Gospels and the Epistles robustly preach that the prophets rejected the Hebrews and replaced them with Gentiles, and the prophets transmitted this message to them. The silence of the Canadian Protestant Church must also be explored when addressing the Christian community. Research showed that mainstay Canadian Protestantism can be defined as a branch of English Canada. While not all Canadians were of Anglo-Saxon character, and their choice of Protestant denomination varied in the major cities and congregations across Canada pre-Second World War era, Canada was a land where imperial connections were highly esteemed. This was still the age of Anglo-conformity, a social mold that can be and has been interpreted in different ways. At its worst, it implied the rule of tribalism and the suppression of non-Anglo minorities. Loyalty to the empire remained a cornerstone of Canadian society in the interwar years, whereby it was determined the 1930s was at the height of Canadian Britishness. It is important to know that in Canadian history, and during the Christie Fifth riot in 1933, anti-Semitism was at its pinnacle in a very British Toronto. Despite English Canada's imperial connections, all the populace was indifferent both to European affairs and to the plight of those caught in the upcoming maelstrom. Canada, which had welcomed refugees in the past, abruptly closed its doors to refugees, particularly Jewish refugees in Nazi times. English Canada extremist rumblings could be heard as a house of fascist movements emerged from coast to coast. Fascist anti-Semitism, a bitterly hostile form, emerged and spread during the 1930s. The question of how anti-Semitism came to be the central feature of the era of fascism is as complex as how anti-Semitism became embedded in Christianity. In the New Testament, many chapters and verses contain false accusations and assertions against Jews. Findings showed how readers of the New Testament could develop a deep animosity for Jews. The hostile tone, the spurious charges, the express antagonism could not but evince negative feelings in the reader for the people against whom they were directed. Nearly every book in the New Testament expresses slander and contempt of Jews. For example, the messages most Christians have registered in their reading of the Epistle of Romans in chapter 3, verse 4. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. And Romans chapter 10, verse 21. But to Israel he saith, all day long I have stretched forth my hands unto disobedience and gainsaying people. Paul the apostle, commonly known as Saint Paul, charged that Jews had killed their prophets. They carried their wickedness of old into their current behavior as they envied and begrudged Gentiles the salvation God had given them. Jews became the enemies of the gospel because they did not believe Paul's teachings in Luke chapter 11, verse 47-48, and he cast the Jews in the role of menace. Paul asked his respondents to pray that he would be rescued from unbelievers in Judea, thus implying that Jews posed a threat to his life. It's not difficult to see how these vivid and ugly portrayals of Jews, traced to a man who was elevated to sainthood, created a feeling of hatred in generations of his readers. The following lines from the 1927 United Church of Canada yearbook reveal the crude and unconstructed character of a segment of contemporary, opinion. Whenever the Jew has settled in any part of the world, he has created new problems, political, social, economic, and religious. The power these people wield among the nations is out of all proportions to their numbers. They have attained positions in finance, commerce, industry, science, philosophy, law, politics, statecraft, and in the press, enabling them to mold thought and public opinion and to influence the life and destiny of nations. No democratic nation can survive unless its roots sink deep into the soil of moral religious truth. It is the task of the church to teach these things unto the people, and especially to their children. Canadian religious institutions, values, and identities are central to comprehending the everyday experiences of Canadian Jews in the early 20th century. Findings support this research that churches in wide-ranging urban centers govern both the configuration and tenor of citizens' religious life. Churches effected the social and cultural expansion of Canadian society, spanning region and language. The United Church of Canada maintained an evangelical institutional identity between the 1930s and 1960s, despite the fact that its leaders did not hold evangelical beliefs. Protestant leading churches, including the Roman Catholic churches, proceeded to agree to this concept of Christian public. Clergymen stopped viewing separation between the church and the world, or between the sacred and the secular, as their view was the entirety of society was regarded to be Christian or potentially Christian. Numerous Canadians associated with a church or religion group, and numerous attended religious services. Anti-Semitism in Canada was deeply rooted in the 1930s. Christie Pitt's The Graphic Novel makes no intentional reference to early 20th century anti-Semitism, but the graphic novel storyline makes such considerations obvious. The graphic novel provides the substructure where anti-Semitism surfaced and acted upon from the citizens of Toronto within the foundation of an unspecified amount of Roman Catholic and Christian Protestant churches. The existential hatred of the Jews was present in Canada. Although not making blatant reference to anti-Semitic conduct, the graphic novel provides today's Canadian citizen with the nation's historic past and its citizens' mindset. As in Chapter 1, the mouth and the headlines, throughout to Chapter 7, the rabbi and the rabbit, the graphic novel and illustrations profoundly frames anti-Semitism. Though Christie Pitt's subject matter is situated in the interwar years and the Great Depression, it describes surroundings with a startling importance. Profound negativity towards Jews and Judaism embedded itself in both Christian doctrine, and their role in Jewish marginalization and victimization was not minor. There are considerable discussions now at the beginning of the 21st century in Canada, speaking to the manifestations of anti-Semitism that come from a wide range of sources. The sources are right-wing racists, anti-Semitic individuals, and groups who have targeted Jews in the past. A Jewish employee of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario was physically assaulted by a customer who noticed his Jewish name on his name tag and told him, "Saul, you're a Jew, a dirty fucking Jew." Universal permission was given to priests by Pope Benedict XVI to celebrate privately and under certain conditions, and even publicly, the Tridentine Mass, which is a Latin Mass, as printed in the 1962 Roman Missal. This was followed by complaints from Jewish groups and some Catholic leaders over what they perceived as a return to supersessionist theology. L'Osservatore Roma, the Vatican newspaper, published a note of the Secretary of State announcing that Pope Benedict XVI had amended the Good Friday prayer for the Jews contained in the 1962 Roman Missal. He decreed that the amended text be used beginning from the current year in all celebrations of the liturgy of Good Friday. The new prayer reads, "Let us all pray for the Jews, that our God and Lord may illuminate their hearts, that they acknowledge Jesus Christ is the Savior of all men. Let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, who want that all men be saved and come to the recognition of the truth, piously grant that even as the fulfillment of the people enters thy church, all Israel be saved. Through our Christ our Lord. Amen." I began this research of considering Jews as the target of Christian anti-Semitism confirmed in the Christie graphic novel, to ask pertinent questions and to reach a place of truth from which to view that terrain and evaluate its pragmatic condition. Indeed, Christianity influenced their flock in the 1930s Canada, which showed its ugly head in their behavior and anti-Semitism towards Jews, and was depicted in the Christie graphic novel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hadassah. Okay, we're going to go straight into a question period. I will remind people asking questions. Ideally, we're looking for questions for the speakers to answer and not statements. So does anybody have any questions? Hernan, please.
Thank you to all three speakers. Really, really interesting papers. I have immediate questions for two, and then hopefully something will emerge for Simone as well. A very straightforward question for Jonathan. Is your work a standalone project here, or is it part of a broader work that you're looking to develop over time? I think that is a really, really interesting project, and I'd like to see it, if I can kind of push you along a little bit, to continue to develop that. And then for Hadassah, I'm sort of trying to get a sense of whether we should be trying to think of this in terms of the religious terms that you framed, and whether we should be thinking of the Christie Pits as, or the anti-Semitism of the period really as a religiously motivated anti-Semitism, or as was conversant at the time, a racial anti-Semitism, and sort of how these things work together or don't work together, and whether you have thought about that. So Jonathan, Hadassah, and Simone, I'm sorry I don't have a question for you right now, but I'll come up with one in a bit, perhaps.
Thanks, Hernan. Well, I was on sabbatical last fall semester, catching up on some long overdue research and writing for a book project that I've been sort of muddling through for a few years, which largely deals with the role of mass media, in particular television, in the political and social development in Quebec between the Quiet Revolution and the October crisis. And there are a lot, and it during the sabbatical, it went from sort of a fairly dry academic treatment of that subject to a very fascinating look at the interplay between a number of personalities. And lo and behold, this is where Naïm Kattan all of a sudden produced himself in my field of vision. So yes, it's part of a larger project, but it also certainly can be a standalone episode in that 11-year history.
Oh, I shall not. Am I off? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right. In response to your question, the graphic novel, from my reading so much about Michael's is the explanation mixed with a narrative about the riot. But and I read it a few times, and my questions that I asked myself is where did all of this anger and hate come from? And reflecting back on the 1930s, it was a different time frame, and the church governed. And so they were very well aware that at that time, and it was taught in schools, that Jews killed Jesus Christ. And that was a very profound statement in their belief that Jews weren't good people, because Jews killed the person that they honored so much. And so that's inspired me to look at this novel as a subtext of what was going on at that time period. And in essence, what was he also saying himself within that graphic novel? And so what I wanted to say, that during that riot, which was the main focus of that novel, was that there was a huge influence from both churches and from all essence of Christianity towards Jews. And that was very prevalent. And that's why I decided to look at this and focus the church and their viewpoints toward Jews in this book. I thought it needed to be discussed. I thought it needed to be looked at. I come through that period.
Thanks for both your answers. Do we have any other questions? Anything from anybody in the audience? Don't be shy. It's the first session of the day, so I understand not everyone's thinking.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Jonathan, there wasn't one name that I didn't know when you spoke. I felt so at home. I lived in Quebec for 25 years, in Montreal for 25 years, and there wasn't. I mean, I met René Lévesque, I met all of them. And it was, so when you were speaking, I was thinking, I felt so comfortable when you were speaking. So thank you so much for that. And I also encourage you to take this further.
Thanks, Hadassah. It's very kind of you. No, it's been a very satisfying and rewarding exploration for me. As I mentioned, I was on sabbatical doing research into some of these personalities and the greater subject of mass media in Quebec in the 1960s. It wasn't as fulfilling as I had hoped. COVID kept me out of a number of archives in the fall, but I'm hoping over the summer I'll be able to explore some more and get access. Both of the McLuhan archives at Toronto were inaccessible to me at the University of Toronto, unfortunately. So I'm hoping I can get there this summer.
Bravo.
I have a question for Simone. I'm going to ask in English if that's okay, but I can try to translate it in my head if need be. I'm just wondering, so I know Yiosh was published in 2014, so that's a recent book. So I'm just wondering if writing about young Hasidic women is a new phenomenon, or is that something that goes back many years, or is that something that's only starting to happen now? I guess my question would be, was that sort of taboo to write about before? I don't know. I don't know this, so that's my question. Oh, you gotta unmute yourself. Hold on.
Vous m'entendez? J'ai cité au début de mon exposé, j'ai cité d'autres romans qui ont été écrits par des écrivaines non juives qui étaient de l'extérieur et qui sont devenus un petit peu des classiques. Alors, je pense que dans le cadre montréalais, oui, c'est assez nouveau. C'est assez nouveau qu'une écrivaine juive qui connaît les chassidim de l'intérieur, puisqu'elle a un peu vécu avec eux, si on peut dire. C'est assez nouveau qu'elle mette en scène comme ça des jeunes filles. Par contre, ça s'est fait aux États-Unis avec un orthodoxe. Enfin, il y a eu des publications. Mais je pense que c'est un livre très spécifiquement montréalais. Ça fait allusion à toutes sortes d'éléments qui sont existants à Montréal et pas ailleurs. Et aussi, ça parle d'une certaine expérience qu'elle a vécue elle-même. On pourrait comparer avec les romans que j'ai cités au début de mon exposé. Par exemple, le roman de Hadassah de Myriam Baudouin, où il s'agit aussi d'une enseignante. Mais là, c'est l'enseignante qui se met en récit elle-même. Non, là, c'est vraiment différent. Je pense que c'est assez nouveau, effectivement, et que ça correspond aussi à un phénomène, alors là, pas spécifiquement montréalais, mais assez mondial. Ça se passe aussi à Montréal, mais aussi à New York et en Israël aussi. Il y a le phénomène des sortants, ceux qui quittent la communauté. Mais je pense que dans le livre de Magali Sauves, il est mis, le problème est abordé d'une façon assez typiquement montréalaise. Est-ce que j'ai répondu à votre question? Je ne sais pas.
Parfait, merci. Okay, any other questions? Anybody with any questions for our speakers? Jason, yes, please.
So I have a question for Hadassah, which is that, so that this narrative form that you're referring to, this kind of graphic novel, has a very clear, there's kind of this archetype in Art Spiegelman's Mouse that I think it's probably hard not to be engaging with. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of if you could do a quick comparison just in terms of what were they drawing on and what kind of differences are there, and maybe how those were used differently in an American context versus an American storytelling context. You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, you're muted.
Similarity, we'll start from there. They're both graphic novels. There is a sense within Christie Pitts that he does refer to what's happening overseas in Nazi Germany, in which Mouse has, it's a story of his father and talks about, the survivorship. So there's a comparison, but within there's truth, I think, in totality overall within Spiegelman's work. Within Michael's work, the major part within that work is the riot. And it builds up from the beginning, and the riot happens at the end of the graphic novel. And he states, it's very humorously, he states at the beginning of the book that it's a work of fiction because he uses fictional characters in the book. And he humorously states that it's a work of fiction because he doesn't want to get sued. So he implements different aspects within that. So it's they're not the same, but they're not the same. That's what I can say to you. If you want something more, if you bring to mind something that you asked, then I can zero in on one specific thing.
Well, I mean, even going back to Hernan's question about racial ideology, I thought it was quite noticeable in terms of, in the American context, they were being represented within this, animalistic kind of racialized framework, whereas that doesn't seem to be the case necessarily in the work that you're looking at. So, I mean, that's just kind of one thing that comes to mind.
I sometimes, nowadays, I tread the line by saying anti-Semitism and race. Yes, it was race in Nazi Germany when Hitler decided to annihilate the Jewish people. That was and how he categorized, where are you the son? Are you the mother? Do you have a grandmother? But I hesitate. I don't want to use race within, for me, race within anti-Semitism. And so one could say that within the Christie Fitz novel that it's racial, but then for me, then it's not, it's anti-Semitic. And I don't equate for me anyway, I look at anti-Semitism down one tributary and I look at race, because when I talk about race today, it automatically goes within the racial issues that are happening in the United States within the Black culture and other, or in here in Canada with the Asian community, because within their race, because they are now with amongst many people being made responsible, so supposedly for COVID and that aspect. So people may differ, I suppose, with my my take on the difference between race and anti-Semitism.
All right, thanks for that. Do we have any other questions? Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, pardon me. My question is for Hadassah. The fact that this is a fictional work and also is a graphic novel, is there a risk that by using such a medium and format that it will trivialize the context and the historical value of the account of the narrative, and that people who are reading it won't take it as seriously, for example, as a nonfiction factual account, or will it open up perhaps audiences that ordinarily wouldn't access material on the subject or on anti-Semitism in general?
The novel, the Christie Fitz novel, the aspect of the riot is true. That's truth. The characters in it are fictional. But how he portrays it, what occurred, the baseball game is true. The Christie Fitz gang is true. They existed, and the violence is true. That happened. They never experienced anything like that ever. I think there's always different ways that you can look at things. For those that are looking at it, perhaps they will ask the same question, and maybe it might be generational, but to say, where did all the, why were they so angry? Was it just, why did they form the Nazi club? Why, but what happened, and which is also detailed in the novel, is that, which was true, and he shows that in the book, that there in the beaches area at that time, there were signs that explicitly said no Jews allowed. That's true, and it's in the book. So the question is yes, we know that was the culture of the times, but again, where did all of this, it stemmed from somewhere. You don't just wake up one day and say, Jews can't belong here, like they did in the United States, no blacks allowed. Jews can't come here. They can't join here. You can only live in a certain section of town. You can't live there. And when they couldn't become doctors, they couldn't go to medical school at McGill. So all of these things existed at that time. So the question I'm hoping is that when they look at it and go the same, always to ask the question, why? Why were they so angry? Why were they so violent? Why did they hate Jews so much? It was a hard time. It was depression, yes, but they took it out on the Jewish community and the new immigrants. So I'm hoping that they ask themselves to open up a new avenue. And I'm not wanting to, I'm always for enlightening and knowing what our history is, and knowing that there is a dark side, and not so many nice people did not so many nice things, but we've grown. But at the same time, I answer towards the end of the book, how much have we grown? So I'm hoping that all of this, and hoping too that we've still got religious issues, And as much as people say that we don't, that we do. So I'm hoping that the question asks, I want to know why all of this took place. And I think it'll still enrich the book. And I think people will still read it.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have time for like the quickest question ever, because we have to end in 3 minutes. Otherwise, we'll close down for 15 minutes. And yeah, I'm just going to continue with that thread unless somebody ends up raising their hand. So we're going to break for 15 minutes. This session will still be open. There will be a breakout room if you want to go chit chat for, about this session or about whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't care what you talk about. And then we'll come back in 15 minutes at 1:45 for session 2 songs. So thank you for coming to this, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.